Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us for the second of our series of spring talks on battles that have some kind of Buckinghamshire connection. And this evening, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Anne Curry, who is going to talk to us about Agincourt. Anne is now Emeritus Professor of Medieval History at the University of Southampton, and she is the internationally recognised expert on the Battle of Agincourt, and indeed on the 100 Years' War as well. Her many publications include Agincourt, 2015, Henry V, From Playboy Prince to Warrior King, 2018, and she edited the Battle of Agincourt with Malcolm Mercer in 2015. She directed the Soldier in the Later Middle Ages Research Project. She's a past president of the Historical Association. She's a past chairman of the Battlefields Trust. She's now deputy master of the Worshipful Company of Fletchers. And just this year, she's been appointed Arundel Herald of Arms Extraordinary. So indeed has come to us hot foot from Westminster. So without further ado, Anne, I'll hand over to you to talk about Agincourt.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone. I'm just going to do a share screen here. And it seemed wise for me to start with a photograph I actually took when I gave an after-dinner speech about Agincourt, I think at a fundraising event for the Lord Lieutenant in 2015. This is in the Judges' Lodgings in Aylesbury, and some of you might know it. It is a picture of the county arms, and this is often said to be linked with Agincourt, that the Buckinghamshire men on the campaign allegedly followed this ensign, if you like, as they made their way to Southampton for embarkation. Now, the problem is that this is not a medieval story. There is nothing in the contemporary sources about the participation of Buckinghamshire men, although I'll come back later to how you might find a few. It is from a poem by Michael Drayton, written in 1627, quite a long poem, and a poem that has within it what's known as the Homerian catalogue. He goes through every county in England, and he has them all marching behind whatever their county sign was at the particular moment in time. So, for instance, the Worcestershire men follow a coat of arms with pears in it, etc., etc. It's quite interesting as well. There's not much about the Welsh here. It's the Lancashire archers who are emphasised as going on the campaign. Now, a lot of this is in Drayton's imagination. This is a poem written quite significantly at a time when England was at war with France, again, campaign at La Rochelle, and it is a very dramatic poem. It's a poem in which we find in the battle knights cleaved in two with a sword or an axe, and we also find quite an amazing recital of the supposed battle that seems to have a siege within it. I'll come back later to this poem because it's quite important in the light of one famous character from Agincourt, Davy Dam, the Welshman who gets mentioned in quite a lot of chronicles at the time as being killed on the battlefield. But the problem with Agincourt is this accretion of later legends and myths, some with some element of truth in them, but these sorts of stories have very much coloured our perceptions of Agincourt and maybe taken away from what is quite a remarkable story and battle in its own right. I'll be starting then with a bit more of this problem of Agincourt, because I think you need to understand this then to understand what we can get of the real Agincourt from contemporary sources. This is another very good example of the problem we face when looking at Agincourt. Everybody wants relics of battles. They want archaeological finds. We haven't had any as yet from Agincourt, but this is a supposed find. You can see it's a spur. The spur is the right type. for 1415, and clearly it's been on the battlefield so long that a tree root has grown around it, and this was given to the Victoria and Albert Museum, see here, and it says it's from the field of Agincourt. Well, it's a forgery. How do we know that? Well, the main giveaway is that there are two others. One is in the Burrell collection and another one was sold at auction in the 1960s. Furthermore, archaeologists have studied this and they know that the timber was softened so that the spur could be pushed into it. It hasn't grown around it. It's quite easy to find out. And also this sort of timber didn't grow in the Agincourt area in 1415. It's a later kind of coniferous tree that wouldn't have been in that area at the time. You can see here with this great desire, particularly in the late Victorian and early Edwardian period, of finding things connected with these great moments of British history. This sort of situation, though, goes on. And in 2015, as Ian said, I had the honour to be closely involved with Agincourt 600. We set up a charity because we were given £1 million by the Chancellor of the Exchequer to commemorate Agincourt. And we funded a good number of projects, both in the UK and in France. And you can see how history is used or abused, because when the Chancellor of the Exchequer announced this £1 million in the budget in 2015, he had the expression that Agincourt was a battle which showed a strong leader. Remember, this was George Osborne saying this, defeating, I quote, an ill-judged alliance between the champion of a united Europe, that was the President of France, and a renegade force of Scottish nationalists. So even in March 2015, he was using Agincourt to have a contemporary political message. And of course, the Scots and the French were in alliance for a lot of the Middle Ages after the 1290s. They were allies in 1415, although in fact the English had the Scottish king in captivity, James I. And so far we've not found any evidence of Scottish involvement in the Battle of Agincourt, but certainly later on, the Scots were important allies. I've been working on the Battle of Beaujeu, a defeat of the English by a Franco-Scottish army in March 1421, and the Scots are very important then, sending troops across to help the Dauphin, later Charles VII there. If you want to know more, we kept all the material about this activity on a website called agincourt600.com, which should still be live. And we did a sort of rundown to the battle from November 2014, when in Parliament, Henry V announced his proposal to attack France. We took it right the way through to November 1415, when he entered London in triumph. Here we are at the University of Southampton, and one of my colleagues there kindly passed on this slide to me because he noticed on a removal van that company was called Agincourt Removals. And it's quite interesting how Agincourt has become a very respected name for companies. I wrote quite a lot about this in my book, in the Great Battles series, published in 2015, where I showed that there are Agincourt care homes, Agincourt dry cleaners, and quite a famous nightclub in Camberley called Agincourt. And so we see here how the idea of Agincourt, of a great victory against the odds, if you like, but also very reliable, very heroic, all of that kind of thing, has found its way even into modern commercialism. Maybe the man to blame for all of this is Shakespeare, whose play of 1599, Henry V, is of course a very famous play. I saw the Donmar Warehouse version of it the other day. It was a very interesting portrayal, really, of it, emphasizing very much the violence. So this is probably the first play performed at the Globe, when the Globe first opened in 1599, and it is a great play. How much of it is real history, of course, is another matter. We don't know what Henry said in his battle speeches, but Shakespeare clearly did, and therefore dramatic effect. They're not historical sources, although they're often quoted as though they are. When in 2015 we had a service in Westminster Abbey of commemoration on the day the news of Agincourt came back to London, 29th of October That's 4 days after the actual battle on the 25th of October. The thing the press reported was not the carefully crafted speech that I made up for the mayor of Agincourt, came over, which was from a First World War reminiscence there. They reported on the Shakespearean speeches, the actor dressed up as Henry who walked down the nave of the church. So it's very difficult to get away from Shakespeare. Whenever you mention Agincourt, somebody wants to put forward a Shakespearean actor and dress them up and even give them bloodstains on their forehead, as in this case here. So Shakespeare's been an enduring influence, and made all the more so by two important films. The 1944 film, which was dedicated to the airborne forces of D-Day. There, Laurence Olivier, quite a lot of the bad stuff cut out about the treason against him, the killing of the prisoners, in order to have a heroic wartime film. Although, interestingly, the French government were not keen that that film should be shown in France, still in wartime, of course, because they thought it portrayed French generals in a rather negative way. And then Branner's film of 1989, on which he wrote quite a lot in his autobiography, where he was very much moved by Vietnam and by an anti-war feeling to it. I think there's quite an interesting contrast between those two films, which I'm sure many of you know. The Olivier film is very much the hero king, but it is a battle won by massed forces, whereas the Branner film, you get a lot of hand-to-hand combat in it. Of course, to do with the way films are made, but I think it also portrays battles in quite a different way between the group effort and the heroism of these particular individuals, Brian Blessed in the middle there, of course. In the late 16th century and the early 17th century, there was a lot of interest in Agincourt. It's not just Shakespeare then. I've mentioned Drayton already, but also I can point to this. This is the so-called Agincourt roll. There are 3 copies of this, and they were made by Robert Glover, the Somerset Herald, in the 1580s. And this must come from a lost original of people who'd been at the battle. It's all to do with the financing, the payments for wages on the campaign, but it lists about 700 odd people who were present at the battle. Unfortunately, because it's all tied up with what the heralds did in the 16th century, it only lists men-at-arms. It doesn't list the archers, although it gives the numbers for those archers, and it's certainly not complete there. But nonetheless, for many years, it dominated the study of Agincourt. It was supposed these were the people there. This was like a battle honours list. To say originally, it was a muster roll after the campaign, all to do with the payment of troops. I'll say a bit more about the payment in a minute. But this text, there's a copy in the College of Arms, another copy in the Bodleian Library, and another copy in the British Library. These were used by heralds on visitations because people came forward and claimed gentility. One of the ways that could do that was by showing that their ancestors had been at an important engagement in the past. Agincourt was a good example, but they did it for the battles of the Wars of the Roses as well. So we have this information here, and we also have the growing interest of gentry families in the battle, so that the Waller family of Groombridge in Kent could claim that they had captured the Duke of Orleans at the battle, and therefore they've hanged his escutcheon from their walnut tree, a play on the name Waller. Well, in fact, although there was a Richard Waller at the battle, they didn't capture the Duke of Orleans there. They had custody of his younger brother, and that was part of a deal of 1412. So this is, again, another myth. As also the Woodhouse coat of arms, these were the Earls of Kimberley in the 19th century, that took inspiration not from the Agincourt roll, but from Drayton's poem, where Drayton had the idea of the Woodhouse of the time going round with a cudgel hitting the French on the head. And you can see the cudgel, you can see the drops of blood there, and the name Agincourt, the motto Agincourt at the bottom. As I said, that poem, The Battle of Agincourt, also invents a special role for Davy Gam. We know nothing about Gam. You know a little bit about his land holdings, his importance as a supporter of the Lancastrians against Glendower. But in fact, Drayton gives Gam words to say, in particular, a very famous expression. My liege, I'll tell you, if I may be bold, we will divide this army into three. One part we'll kill, the second prisoners stay, and for the third we leave to run away. It is a comment about the French army. And he gives him other things like a dispute with another soldier over a prisoner, and then the involvement with Woodhouse in an assault on a fort. And it says that it was in that Gam was killed. This is all invented, remember, by Drayton. And in fact, Drayton got the idea of that idea of splitting the army into three from Walter Raleigh, his History of the World of 1614, linked to Hannibal rather than to the Battle of 1415. So you can see how these almost Chinese whispers of history, Drayton obviously thought it was a nice expression about a battle. I'm going to put it into my poem and I will give it to Davy Gam. So it sort of beefs all of this up. Now, we know that Gam actually served on the campaign, and what I'm showing you on the screen here is pretty fundamental. This is a contracted army. It numbered over 12,000 men, raised by Henry V, and everyone, the captains who signed up, if you like, promised to bring a certain number of troops, and Gam was to serve as a man-at-arms with 3 archers, and this is his contract, his indenture. Here. These are all in the National Archives. You can see there's lots of terms and conditions in this kind of thing as well. So we have some real evidence of Gam's participation on the campaign. Unfortunately, we don't know the names of his archers. We haven't got a muster roll for him. You might also be interested, and this is another example of the Shakespearean idea, that in 1910, shortly after the death of Edward VII, there was a big military display at Fulham, and the Agincourt sequence was to show line against column here, and they very much based it on the Drayton poem and on the Shakespeare play. And so David Gam is given a special role with, you can see some other Welsh people participating in that. So Shakespeare, Drayton, all of this is very much coloured the way. This is really a pretty early reenactment, and it was directed by someone who had been very active in Shakespearean drama at the time, rather than by a military organiser here. We also see, of course, that Agincourt had come to stand for British superiority, particularly against the French. And as we fought the French so much from the late 17th century onwards, it's not surprising that whenever we were at war with France in the 18th century and the early 19th century, you get this outpouring of "remember Agincourt." And I've got here a few quotations from newspapers of that period, 1744, the War of the Austrian Succession, Agincourt, oh glorious day, you know, the enemy misconstrued what we were up to. We really had the enraged fury of the lion, British valor and the terror of our nation to shine forth now. I.e., we did it in the past, let's do it again. And it's quite significant that the first invocation of the anniversary in a newspaper comes during the 7 Years' War in 1757, where in, I think it's in North Britain newspaper, we have that today is the anniversary of the Battle of Agincourt. See this in the Republican, the wars against the French Republic at the end of the 18th century as well. And quite interesting here, the French preserve their character. The events of this war show we're not degenerated. We think we may, without arrogance, assert that in the hour of severest trial, we have proved ourselves worthy of our glorious ancestors. So there was this moral superiority against the French that also continued as the Napoleonic Wars went on. And in 1805, you could have paid a shilling to go and see this huge picture by Robert Kerr Porter, who did one of Seringapatam as well. And this was a picture of Agincourt. If any of you know the battlefield, I suspect many of you do, you'll know it is not hilly at all, it is very flat. but this is very much taken from medieval illuminations of battles, which nearly always have a castle on a hilltop on the back of them. You have a look, if it's Bouvines, much earlier, or Crécy, they all have the same kind of landscape. These are stylized artistic representations, but this was quite a dramatic, huge painting there, which alas has been lost. But it had, for instance, a cottage with smoke coming out the chimney, showing, you know, the civilians being attacked there, and a wife over the body of her dead French husband and things of this sort. So it was not just the sort of military side of it, but I hope you can see there, there's an archer at the right-hand side of the picture, and various other portrayals of hand-to-hand combat in this. And when the war ended in 1815, in the Lord Mayor's show of that year, in November, they dressed somebody up in the gold armor. Henry V had become quite common from the 18th century onwards, and they had relics of Waterloo as well. So the two were put together, 1415 and 1815 there. In the First World War, we see this as well, and these are amazing photographs from the Illustrated London News, but also published in France, showing that on the 25th of October 1915, so the 500th anniversary, the French at the Château de Tramcourt, quite near Agincourt, invited the British to share this day of honourable memory to both nations. And we have quite a lot of documentary evidence of this event. And here we see the French commandant showing the British commanders around the battlefield. I'd just love to get hold of those handouts that they're holding, but I haven't been able to. Now, ironically, as I say, we have information from the military records of the French about this, and we know it didn't actually happen on the 25th of October. It had rained too much, and so it was actually postponed to the 26th. Well, what about then the real Agincourt? And for the rest of this talk, I'm going to concentrate on that. And we have a lot of records to draw on. The English government in the late Middle Ages was nothing if not bureaucratic. So here we are in the Parliament of November 1414, where the king, needing a tax grant to wage war against France, puts forward to the assembled Lords and Commons the idea that to get peace, we must go to war. And that was very much a mantra of Henry V at virtually all the parliaments in his reign. And he's saying we have the truth of the quarrel in this matter, which is necessary. So it's a just war here. And the king understands that a suitable time has come for him to accomplish his purpose with the aid of God. While we have time then, Chancellor announced, let us work for good. Let us invade France, in other words. Henry got the tax grant he wanted, but you're going to say, why was it then a suitable time? Well, we'd already been at war with the French. We'd claimed the French throne since 1340. We'd done well, and then we'd done badly again. Henry V then chooses to reopen this war, and that is because there was effectively civil war in France in this time. And this had come from a debate between the Burgundians, as John the Fearless, the cousin of the king essentially, and the Orleanist or Armagnac party, a great struggle for control of the king, Charles VI, who's in the middle there. From 1392, Charles had shown signs of insanity, and these were getting worse and worse, till effectively there had to be a regency government. And the Duke of Orleans, his brother, Charles VI's brother, was initially very powerful in this, but he was assassinated in 1407 by John the Fearless. And so this is really what gets the Civil War into a very bad state, and indeed led eventually in 1419 to the assassination of John the Fearless himself by the then leader of the Armagnacs. It's a very, very difficult time in French history, even though the French had come to some sort of pact between Burgundians and Armagnacs in 1414, after quite a serious civil war, in 1414 into 1415. They were by no means united, and therefore it was a sensible time for any English invasion in order to try to exploit this division. Enough said that the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, was not at the Battle of Agincourt. In fact, the royal government, the advisors to the king, had tried to keep both the Duke of Burgundy and the heir, the new Duke of Orleans, away from the army on that occasion. It didn't work for the Duke of Orleans. The young Duke Charles was present and was captured. The Duke John of Burgundy was not involved, but two of his brothers were killed in the battle. So still quite a lot of Burgundians present, but that civil war situation is very significant in understanding why Henry V was to do as well as he did. I mentioned these indentures previously. We have evidence of over 500 companies indenting under their leaders. This is Sir Thomas Erpingham, a famous Norfolk knight who was about 57 at this time and a veteran of wars going back to the time of the Black Prince. And he indented for 20 men-at-arms and 60 archers. That 1-to-3 ratio, we saw that from Gam himself and 3 archers, is very common in this period. It was the optimum, 1 man-at-arms for 3 archers. And we have evidence that Erpingham maintained that number because we've actually got muster rolls that he mustered his troops. This one isn't actually his. This is a muster of the largest retinue on the campaign. That was a retinue of 960 men, led by the king's eldest brother, Thomas, Duke of Clarence, who was killed at the Battle of Beaujeu in 1421 that I've been working on recently. Now, what's interesting here, you may see on the left-hand screen there, Agincourt, that's Sir John Agincourt, who brought a company there. To the right-hand there, you've got him with some miners because there were going to be sieges undertaken. So we have miners there, quite a number of miners from the Forest of Dean known to be on the campaign. But on the right-hand image, you can see here these sub-retinues, if you like. Even the Duke of Clarence didn't know 960 men to recruit, and therefore what he did was use subcontractors. Some were people already connected with him in his household knights, things. Others were from the estates he controlled. Others were just any knights and gentry who might wish to join up and to bring troops, often very small companies, as you can see here, not very many men at all. Now, one of my PhD students at Southampton, Michael Warner, did a very interesting study of the retinues of Clarence and of Duke of Gloucester, the youngest brother of Henry V, and you can buy his book on these retinues. But what he showed that in Clarence's retinues, there were many of these companies, well into the 60s, of numbers of sub-companies in Clarence's 960 men. You can see here that he showed the majority of them were these tiny groups of men. The larger retinues are for Clarence himself and also for some of the peers, such as Lord Lumley, who's on the campaign. Now, if you want to know more about these muster rolls, have a look at our site, medievalsoldier.org, and it's there that you will find that letters of protection were taken out by some men in Clarence's retinue, and they are labelled as coming from Buckinghamshire. Quite often these legal documents, which were to give you freedom from any trials in your absence, essentially mention the place people came from. And we know that a man called John Stokes was in Clarence's retinue, or William Alwayn was serving under Sir Roger Trumpington, or Walter Sheff was on the campaign, and he's said to be of Aylesbury. So we have some insights into this, and it's a topic that would benefit from local historians who will know the names of these people, trying to find some men from these areas. I've been more interested in the army as a whole. Michael has done this work by the overall commander there, and obviously there's been work done too on the Welsh soldiers of this period by another of my PhD students, Adam Chapman, because there were some special archer companies we're going to see in a minute, including ones from Wales. Well, in fact, here we are. The indented muster there, Sir Thomas Erpingham's. Okay, he said he'd bring 20 plus 60 men. Did he? It's all to do with fraud. That's what these muster rolls were about. Did the captain meet the terms of its indenture? Let's check when he assembles near Southampton in order to go on the campaign. And this muster was taken on the heath of Southampton in July of 1415. And these troops then sailed off. You've got the squires, men-at-arms as they were at the top there, and the archers at the bottom. And in the middle, we've got some extra men. Erpingham was very well known, and he was able to exceed the 20 plus 60. And so those in the middle are lances outre son nombre, in addition to his number. Essentially, these are waiting for others to die, and then they get the job. On the right hand, we've got the muster of the some of the Welsh archers, 500 archers recruited from South Wales, 500 archers from Lancashire, and probably 350, although potentially 600 from Cheshire. These are additional companies then. All of the retinues otherwise are this 1 to 3 or 1 to 2, but in addition, we have these special dedicated archer companies. Overall, the numbers that set out, about 12,000, had a ratio of 1 man-at-arms to 4 archers. It's an archer-rich army, in fact, made all the more so because a number of men-at-arms became ill at the siege of Harfleur. In fact, dysentery seems to have affected the men-at-arms more than the archers. Here we have these amazing Welsh names, extremely difficult, incidentally, to put into a computer database. The siege of Harfleur we can reconstruct from that muster and pay evidence. We know that Clarence was the commander on the landward side, and his camp suffered from dysentery, but not perhaps as much as the royal camp, where the Earl of Arundel, for instance, and the Bishop of Norwich, both Henry's close friends with him on the campaign, both of them died from dysentery. But we can say a bit about the mines. I can show you records for Harfleur 1418-19 was captured, where the mines had to be filled in later on. But the importance of this siege is that Henry lost some men to attack by the difficulties of the campaign, but also from dysentery. And probably he lost about 1,800 men. Men were invalided home. They were mustered, they sort of checked, and then they sailed back to England, including the Duke of Clarence and a good number of his own troops. And we know about this as well. On the left, these are lists of men sent home. Henry was going to be checking, because he was obviously going to be deducting wages. People were paid in advance for the campaign. So if you'd gone home, you had to have some of your wages taken back, and certainly you weren't going to be paid for the next 3-month period. And on the right, the slightly more complicated muster, this is the retinue of the Earl of Arundel, as I say, died at the siege. And these actually are people replacing those who took ill or died and went home. So in fact, Henry was able to rebuild his army to a certain degree, but nonetheless, he decided that he was not going to continue the campaign when the Harfleur finally fell to him on the 22nd of September. He'd set out in the middle of August, and therefore that siege had taken about 5 to 6 weeks, probably longer than he'd anticipated. And I think personally he'd hoped to get many more conquests of places and hadn't been able to. So he decided that he was going to move away from Harfleur. He was going to draw the French away from Harfleur, because he'd caused a lot of damage through his cannons on that breach, the once more into breach that Shakespeare mentions. There were lots of holes in the walls of Harfleur, and therefore he had to move away from there and draw the French away in order that the place wouldn't immediately fall back into their hands. What we have on the screen here is more evidence of what happens to the English army. This is Erpingham's material, and it's all to do with the pay records. See the big word summa in the middle there, to account after the campaign for the money received in advance, any prisoners taken, and wages due, that kind of thing. Henry had paid his men partly in cash before they set out, but he'd also had to mortgage the future. Men like Erpingham didn't get payment of all the wages for their troops. They got precious objects out of the royal jewellery cupboard, even crowns sometimes given to people, and these were security for future payment of wages, payments that would be affected by 1417. So he sort of planned the repayment over a long period of time. In other words, Henry V, even with tax grants, hadn't had enough money to go on this campaign, but he was so determined to invade France that he got round it. Erpingham's role here reflects what happened to his company. Most of them are with him at the Battle of Agincourt, but two of the people there had been killed at the siege, and we see also another man about at the end of the men-at-arms who says died at Calais, died after the battle. So we can trace what happens to many of these troops then, who was with Henry in the actual march to Agincourt. And we can see more here. This is a very interesting role because it's got the retinue of Thomas Lord Camoys, who was 65 at the time and was to command the rear guard at the battle. We can see his retinue hadn't been much affected by dysentery. All of them then are on the march with Henry. And this just a little slide to show you a medieval file system. All the stuff to do with Erpingham was put in a little bag here, fastened up and hung on a peg in the exchequer with Erpingham written across it. So even without computers, you can be well organized. So in our projects, we've put together all of these lists, both the muster rolls when they set out, the retinue rolls as they're called, showing what happened to the army during the campaign, and we can reconstruct the army in this kind of way. And one interesting thing there is that we can trace here that the Lancashire archers, remember I said 500 of them, were used as a special personal bodyguard for Henry V himself. Lots of shared experiences. We can see who'd been on campaign before, whose retinues had been reorganized, maybe where retinues became small through some men getting dysentery. We can see them being reformed there. So we can really reconstruct this army and end up with at least 8,500 men on the march that Henry was to make. Now, on this map, we always put the English in red, and here they are. They set out from Harfleur on about the 8th of October. They move up the coast to the river Somme here. We can trace this day by day. They didn't attack anywhere, but they often threatened to, and in return, they were given food supplies. Henry supposedly had hoped he had enough food for 8 days, which was deemed to be enough to get from Harfleur to Calais. But when they got to the Somme, they heard that a large French army was on the northern bank, and Henry did not dare attack them. I think, though, there's no doubt that Henry wanted to get to Calais, but he was forced inland. And at every point along here, he's harried by the French around Corby in particular, we're going to see. And also we know additional troops shadowing, coming up from Rouen there, getting across the river to the other side there, but other troops already based on the northern bank of the Somme. So it took him a lot longer, not till the 19th of October, then another 2 weeks essentially, before he managed to cross the Somme here and then to move north. When he was in this area, the French realized that they were in danger of not being able to bring him to battle. And so it seems the heralds from the French went out and summoned him to battle. It's likely that they summoned him to this place, Aubigny on Artois. But you can see that Henry doesn't move in that direction. He turns westwards here. Nonetheless, he was into the French managed to sort of intercept him, intercept him at Agincourt. They got there first. Now, it is quite significant, however, this idea of the battle being planned for Aubigny-en-Artois. Many medieval battles actually were planned in advance, and decisions on where they should be fought. We think that some French troops had made for Aubigny, and that meant that some of them never got to the battlefield of Agincourt, or else got there late, like the Duke of Brabant. Famous people who didn't get there were the Duke of Brittany, for instance, who got to Arras but didn't get to anywhere further north than that, and various other troops there. So that is going to minimize the French army. And again, as you'll see later, there are muster rolls for the French as other financial documentation. I don't think there can have been more than 12,000 French meeting Henry at Agincourt. Particularly also, I mentioned the Duke of Burgundy isn't there. But when the English were just opposite Corbie, there was a rumor that the French were going to attack and they were going to override the archers. Now, the French army has some archers, but it is mainly men-at-arms, and therefore, and also quite a bit of cavalry there. Henry's troops are mounted, but the proportion of mounted cavalry that could fight in that way is not high at all. He's probably only got about 1,300 men-at-arms, say, and he's going to use those on foot. He's really pretty short of cavalry. The idea then that they're going to override the English archers, and famously, Henry orders the archers to prepare stakes, which they will put in front of them. Remember, Henry has got about 7,000 archers in his army. They're very useful. They can keep the enemy at bay, and recent research has suggested arrows did pierce armor. Even when they didn't, they gave you a pretty nasty knock there, enough to stop the heart there. And therefore they need to be protected because they cannot fight in the melee. They haven't got full plate armor. So in order to maximize the value of archers and protect the men-at-arms as well from an immediate onslaught from the French, protect all from cavalry attack, this stake system, which seems to have been an Ottoman tactic in 1396 at the Battle of Nicopolis, is going to be used by Henry, because they don't fight at Corbie, they fight at Agincourt. But we know more about this. Said in the Chronicles this is going to happen, but we actually have the French battle plan. Probably not the plan for the actual Battle of Agincourt, but for a battle the French anticipated fighting north of the Somme. This is a very interesting document in the British Library. It was formed, it was in the Cotton collection and in the Cotton Fire in the 1750s, hence the damage to it. But it tells us there of this plan to have cavalry charges. It tells us of the plan to raid the baggage at the back. It's quite remarkable. I like to think, of course, that Henry V had captured it through his spies before the battle, but it's also been said possibly it was captured after the battle. We don't quite know then whether Henry had this particular document. We do know that he was wise to this threat of a French attack by cavalry on his archers. Getting across rivers was very, very difficult, and the chronicles make a huge amount, the English chronicles make a huge amount of Henry getting across the Somme, that's on the left there, and then getting across the river Ternoise, which is just south of Agincourt. And this, I think, is important to remember in the light of why didn't he cross the Somme? An army is very vulnerable when crossing rivers, particularly a large army that is in enemy territory. It is very vulnerable to enemy attack. And that explains why Henry moved so far inland in the hope of not meeting the French. And indeed, he didn't. And it's also said in the text that he took shutters and things, even windmill sails, in order to make bridges across, ways to get horses and men across the River Somme. Having got across the Tournoise there, his army marched up the hill. And if you imagine you are the English army, there you are on this plain, and you would have seen the French in the distance. We are here in the traditional battlefield of Agincourt, and I'll come back to whether it is the real place towards the end of my talk. That is deemed to be the middle of the battlefield. That's certainly where we had commemorations in 2015. You can imagine the French are here, ranged there towards Risseville, and the English on this side towards Besançon. A very nice plan from Matthew Bennett's book on the Battle of Agincourt. Here we are, the English in 3 battles, the king in the middle, the Duke of York on the right, the vanguard, and Lord Camoys in the rear guard. I think they would not have been in a line like that. I think the vanguard is actually quite forward and the rear guard there. And I think it's quite significant that Camoys, a 65-year-old, was given command of the rear guard, but it's got to stand there watching what else is going on and then be brought in later, if indeed they're ever brought in at all in this particular battle. The archers here, probably curving round rather more than this, given the number, possibly some archers in the front here, although then the stakes would need taking out as they retreated. The French forming large companies here, particularly a very, very large vanguard there, but also portrayed here the attacks, attempted attacks on the archers here. Interestingly, the French chronicles show that the French couldn't raise enough cavalry. Nobody wanted to be in that cavalry. It's often said it's all chivalric. What's the fun in killing archers? We want to be getting Henry V himself here. It's not just that. We know that arrows damaged horses considerably. And why would you want to ride into that? That's not really the sort of war you want to fight anyway. So the fact they couldn't get enough men to volunteer is significant. It also shows the command problems they've got. Here we have the king. On this side, we haven't really got a supreme commander. The Duke of Orleans, very young, very inexperienced. There are some other men there. The chronicles tell us of disputes between the old and the young, hot-headed, who want to get going against the English, and the older men who urge some degree of caution. Of course, this is a nice little diagram because it shows the 3rd division here running away. What seems to have happened was, as the van moved forward, the arrows, as you can imagine, forced them well, they slowed them down, and that's quite significant in a battle like this. And they also forced them really they couldn't raise their weapon arms. They also fell on top of each other. And maybe the best way of thinking about this is if you were in a room with people on the sides, they're throwing tennis balls towards you. That's exactly what you do. You try to defend yourself and you'd fall in on each other. And the soils would also make that quite likely. It's been suggested that when men fell face down, essentially they suffocate. And the accounts tell us of these great heaps of wounded and dead. And it does make you wonder then how many of the French actually came to grips with the English. We know they did against the Duke of York because he is killed, and also the Earl of Suffolk and other men in their companies. See this in the muster rolls too. But I think that side engages, but these here maybe don't really get close enough. And there's one account that suggests this was only a half an hour of battle, that maybe some of the 2nd Guard ploughed into here and just ended up on top of the vanguard that had gone through there, and the rest, seeing that it was impossible to fight further, fled. Of course, Henry then thinks there's going to be another attack, and that's when famously he kills the prisoners. Now, not surprising, because he knows that there are more French than there are English, and he doesn't quite know what they're going to do. Also, as I said, the Duke of Brabant comes late. That's the most likely reason that Henry thought a new attack was going to be launched. Now, the point here is that if you have these heaps here, we know Henry ordered, he thought the battle was over, ordered them to be searched for the living who could be ransomed. To do that, his soldiers would have taken off their helmets and their gauntlets. Therefore, they were no longer in a good position to fight the French if they were to come back onto the field. So I think there is a military logic for that killing of the prisoners that must also be at some distance, time-wise, from what we might call the Battle of Agincourt. Now, just to show this was the very good plan put into Matt Bennett's book from the Osprey series, showing the plan to attack at the rear and also this attack on the archers at the front, and some idea of putting the companies together based on that battle plan. If you've been to Agincourt, you will know that the soils are very sort of claggy, really quite difficult to move through. You can say, well, why did the English suffer from that? Because it does seem as though the land to the south towards Maisoncelles is slightly firmer. So the French are forced to go across land that even here, these pictures were taken on the 25th of October one year when I was there. You can see it gets extremely waterlogged, and here the effects of the tractor going through there. So also it's thought the French exercised their horses over this area during the night before. So not easy land by all means to walk across, is essentially what the French were doing. The main battles in this period were to be fought on foot. The estimates of sizes have exercised historians for some time, and you're not going to know maybe all of this. What I want to show here is very much, we're in fisherman territory, the length of the fish you've captured, because in the English chronicles, they always exaggerate. What's the point of saying we defeated 12,000 French? No. Why not say 60,000? No, that's not enough. Why not say 140,000? And so these figures get hugely exaggerated. And this one here, from an English text, was taken up then by Hall and Hollinshead, this 120,000. The French, on the other hand, you're being beaten. You're not going to say there was many people on your side. And indeed, there are some, the Berry Herald and Richemont, who actually put the figure at lower than the English. So this is all in the telling, really, as to how many the French thought they had at the battle. We do have financial records for the French. We know that in the previous year, they'd raised about 14,500 in part of that civil war. We also know that in August of 1415, when Henry's about to land, they raised a tax for 9,000 men. And within that, we have muster evidence for the Duke of Berry with 1,000 men-at-arms and 500 gens de trait. They are longbowmen and crossbowmen who don't seem to have been used at all, really, in the battle. Not until later in the century are the French able to raise more than about 15,000 men. I've been trying to work on the French army, and here's some muster roll evidence for them. We haven't got as much data, but we can actually do quite a bit with it. We can also look at how many people died. I can validate only 380 men, and we can identify 320 prisoners. These are nothing like the figures that chronicles give. However, they are high. They are high. If this battle only lasted half an hour or maybe a bit longer, these are very, very high mortality rates. And indeed, one English chronicle says the killing of the prisoners is the reason why so many French nobles died. So some of this then, the 380, could be very much linked to that rather than dying within the battle itself. If you think I'm wrong and that the French army must have been much bigger, do take account of the fact that we know a lot about later French armies, and it's not until the reign of Louis XIV that the French are raising anywhere around 100,000. So those English chronicle figures are totally wrong. And indeed, not until the end of the century, when they invade Italy, have the French got over 20,000 men. The English also start to expand their army sizes phenomenally, really, under Henry VIII, particularly with more archers and also with calling out of sort of troops by array. Now, Henry hasn't done that. This army that I've talked about is entirely a paid army. It is a volunteer army where captains like Erpingham sign up to bring a certain number of troops. It's not feudally recruited in any kind of way, other than special areas, the Duchy of Lancaster, the Earldom of Chester, and the Principality of Wales and South Wales, because the north is still suspected because of Glendower's rebellion. Now, I've said not that many died. 380 can be validated, although 550 are found. I've got names for this, however, some of them are dubious. They're in later traditions, and some we can show were still alive a few years later. But the point about this is that they are from very restricted geographical areas in France. And so the impact on Normandy and Picardy is huge. And it really helps Henry in his later invasions that so many men have been killed. And in some families, we find whole groups, fathers, and maybe 2 or 3 sons die together at that battle. So for some families in France, it was absolutely destructive, and therefore Agincourt is a battle where the French suffered hugely and the English hardly at all. This is the traditional field where reenactments take place, but there is some doubt as to whether it is the right place or not. Battlefield detectives on Channel 4 actually did an archaeological survey, field walking, various resistivity projects. We found absolutely nothing, in fact, nothing medieval, which would suggest this actual area was woodland in 1415. Now, this is where that photograph is, between Agincourt and the village of Tramcourt here. And the reason why it's thought to be here, there's a little castle that some of the texts say Henry had the battle named after that castle. It's a line that's taken up by Shakespeare, of course, later on. But this is the modern Ordnance Survey map. On the first map we have, well, it's a diagram really, in Harris Nicholas's History of the Battle of Agincourt, 1827, Agincourt, as he's put it here, is actually to the east of the battlefield, whereas here, it's to the west of the battlefield. So are we looking here when we should be looking across here? Nicholas took it from a map of the 18th century, and that would suggest again that the battle was fought to the west of Agincourt. Why then do we think it was fought to the east? Because of John George Woodford. After the Napoleonic Wars, this area had an army of occupation in it, and this chap was the Quartermaster General. He got very interested in the Battle of Agincourt, so much that he drew this map. This is an accurate survey, and he put the English on here, and there's that castle again at Agincourt village here, Tramcourt village, and the chateau here that we saw in the First World War picture, and he put the French on. And he also noted on it around here a calvaire and a place he thought was where the French had been buried. Now, this is, if you like, a Tolkien Middle Earth. This map is accurate geographically, but these positions come from Woodford's reading of the chronicles. He had no real evidence that that is where the battle had been fought. He did some excavations. We don't know what happened to that. Mysteriously, the finds that he'd made were all destroyed in a fire in London a few years later. And I think there's quite a lot of doubt surrounding the validity of this work by Woodford. That was where we think he dug, where the Calvaire is. We're in the middle of the battlefield here. We've done archaeological work here and in this field. Nothing has been found, no burial pits at all. A lot of excitement digging in here when something was found, and it turned out to be an oil drilling equipment from the 1970s. So far, nothing whatsoever found in bodies or battle finds. There are First World War finds there. There are Roman finds, but as I say, no medieval finds. This was put up in the 1850s, and that's also sort of enhanced the idea that that's where people are buried, but they're not. That was the survey. They're all the finds, not medieval. There are, however, some Agincourt burials a few miles away at the Church of Hedin. This was a Benedictine abbey in the period. You can see here various bodies that were dug up in the 1930s. And we have a list there, and we've been able to find out who these people actually are. And one of them was a man called Gallois le Fougère. He was the provost marshal of the army in 1415, in charge of discipline. And the French have seized on him as the first gendarme to fall for France. So there he is now in the Gendarmerie Memorial in Versailles. You see there, Marshal of France, killed at Agincourt, 1415. In 2015, therefore, the French celebrated this defeat by celebrating the life of Gallois le Fougère, the first gendarme to fight for France. And these are actual gendarmes who put on medieval armor in order to be at the mass at the church where Gallois originally was buried to commemorate that. Unfortunately, during the lunch afterwards, a call went up that there were problems with migrants at Calais, and they had to change into their modern uniforms and go off and try to sort that out. So where then was this battle fought? If it wasn't fought in this traditional area, where was it fought? Well, Tim Sutherland suggested it may have been further north. It's got to be where there is a sort of hill and then a valley of some sort. It's much more likely that the geography fits here rather than this very flat land here. So that would be that landscape. So it'd be where the French are standing and the English would be down here. It's a possibility. Another possibility is to follow that 18th century map and look to the west of Agincourt. And that's what the landscape is like. I'm much more likely, much more like Cressy, for instance, where the French are here and the English on this slope here. Certainly also advantageous in terms of arrow fire to be on a rise there. And also it makes it much more difficult for the French to cross the land into the face of that arrow shot. Another view of what that kind of landscape might be like. This is to the west of Agincourt, and there was a lot of excitement when a body was found across here, but it doesn't seem as though it is linked to the battle, unfortunately. The French, of course, want to have a site. Everybody nowadays wants battlefield tourism. I certainly want that too. But the problem with this is we don't know where it was fought. The second problem, you have to get hold of land. And the only place they could get hold of land was near Maisoncelles, the southern end of the battlefield, where the English seemed to have camped the night before the battle. And they put up this monument in the 1960s. Interestingly, they chose the feast day of Joan of Arc to do it in order to emphasize the English may have won the battle. but they didn't win the war. We also got a little monument to Galois Le Fougère here, and one or two other people. In 2015, there was quite an influx of interest and money. Agincourt 600 paid for a viewing tower, but because they only own this bit of land near to the monument, it had to be put there. But it is, I think, quite helpful, given the flatness of the site, to be able to view it from up here. In the early 2000s, with European money, the village of Agincourt, commune of Agincourt, built a very fine centre historique. And the architect, though French, chose the longbow and arrow for the frontage of the museum. It was quite effective, but not very good for visitors, in the sense that once you got about 4 inside there, it was full. And so also it started to fall. The foundations had not been dug, so it's actually been taken down. And the new museum, completely refurbished in 2019, uses some of the same buildings, but has had other bits. But I do visit it. As you can see here, it's really quite impressive, with various audiovisuals, facsimile weapons and clothing and armor. And this amazing thing, just as you enter, which is the Wall of French Dead. And I'm pleased to say it takes the 380 names that I was able to find. It's very, very evocative. I think extremely well done. My final slide then. Another thing that happened in 2015 was a new monument to the dead of both sides. And we met there the British ambassador, the Effet of the department, and all of the local officials there. As you can see here, the commemoration, it was quite an amazing event. And you can see here the Union Jack, which of course is anachronistic for the battle, the tricolour, also anachronistic, and the European Union flag, not an issue in 2015 there. So quite an interesting assemblage there of unity across the centuries, so to speak. We might have worried about this. We didn't need to, because when we went the following morning, all 3 flags had disappeared. And so that took out the political difficulties with it. But do, if you can, visit the site, and particularly visit the museum, because I think it has been done extremely well, following new museum ideas. It's not easy to have a museum for a battle where we've no finds, for a battle where we don't know quite where it was fought, for a battle also that is, this museum is much used for educational purposes in France, quite a lot on everyday life, activities for children. And they had a rather clever idea on the source materials, the chronicles. They actually had them made as though they were newspapers. I translated a lot for them from French into English, so it's a truly bilingual museum there. It talks about the armies in a very balanced kind of way, and it has reenactments, and it's really well worth visiting as an example of how you can have this kind of museum. And it replaces the previous one, which was an interesting place, but where it was wholly Shakespearean. It had dummies with hologrammed faces, and the words were all Shakespeare's. So I think, again, it's an interesting example of even the French were heavily influenced by the Shakespeare's portrayal of the Battle of Agincourt, rather than what we can find through modern research. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that, Anne. A couple of sort of things occur to me. I mean, clearly there are potential sites where the battle might have been held. Are there any plans to dig further in any of those possible sites?
Yes, I mean, there was some hope that for 2015 we would be able to do some work, particularly to the west. It has not been possible. In France, you need lots of permissions, but particularly from the DRAC, which is a kind of equivalent to English heritage. or historic England probably, and that's not been forthcoming because they're not convinced that the effort will be repaid, i.e. is there anything new to find, so to speak. So I think it would need quite a lot of preparatory work, field walking, drone activity perhaps, but I think at present it's not very likely.
Okay, fine. The other thing which occurred to me is I was rather glad to see Robert Kerr Porter's panorama, and that, of course, you know, I think it's about 1910 was about the last time anybody thought it actually existed, although there are reports of it in the 1880s. What strikes me about the plan, which of course does survive, is that there don't appear to be any archers on it.
There are some, but by no means as many. And this is interesting. If you look at prints in English history books, certainly not as many archers there. I think in the 18th century in particular, it became very focused on Henry V. Henry V gets into everything, and therefore the others are kind of also rans. There's not much effort to have genuine armour. So occasionally, I was thinking particularly of the, I've got to know his name, but there are three, there are paintings that were owned by Queen Charlotte, I think, and these were commissioned. And I think there, again, the archers play a very minimum role in it because it didn't really go with the idea of heroism and the role of the individual and the role of the monarch. In all of this. Maybe they're not that interesting once you've painted one archer or a kind of group. In one of those paintings, you just see lots of longbows.
Although, of course, that's become almost a dominant theme, hasn't it, really?
Well, rightly so, because this is the point about this army. I mean, the English, even in the 14th century, the English armies have very large numbers of archers in them, but not as many as in 1415. Looking at the ratios, which is quite important, from 1369 through to about 1400, the ratio was 1 man-at-arms to 1 archer. That's obviously what the English thought was the optimum. But as the 15th century came along, the ratio goes up. To get an army quickly, it was easier to recruit archers. They were only 6pence a day. Man-at-arms was a shilling a day, so you could have more of them for your money. And if you're short of money, it's a way of getting a big army. But the 1-to-3 ratio comes in 1406 in the Welsh Wars, and therefore it may be Henry, Prince of Wales' own idea of this. It remains dominant into the 1430s, and then gradually it goes up and up and up until you get to 1-to-8, 1-to-11. The armies, as I say, of Henry VIII, you know, are in the 1-to-11 category. So the proportion of archers in English armies actually goes up over the course of the 15th century.
Okay, I'm looking at the chat. I don't think we've got any particular questions coming in at the moment. Let me have a look. No, I think you've been so comprehensive in your coverage that there are no particular questions. But well, thank you for that, Anne. I will now hand over to Derek.
Thank you.
Thanks. Just let me share my screen. Have you got that?
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. Anne, that was quite outstanding. On behalf of the Trust, can I say a massive thank you for being with us tonight and sharing your knowledge and dare I say it, your enthusiasm for the subject. It was really good. So thank you again. I'd also like to thank Ian Beckett because he's the one who's done all the legwork to set these lectures up. So thanks, Ian, not just for chairing, but for all the work you do to make these things actually happen. This was the second of our spring series of lectures. The third and final lecture will be on the 14th of June. And Dr. Bill Mitchinson will be talking about the 48th South Midland Division in the First World War. And of course, The South Midland Division included the 1st Bucks Battalion. So that there should be a lot of interest to a Buckinghamshire audience in that talk. If I can just press on. A quick shout out for the annual Viney Memorial Lecture, which is happening on Sunday, the 26th of June, in association with the Buckingham Literary Festival. Rob Lyman will be talking about what have we forgotten about the Forgotten War, and that's the war in Burma during World War II. And it'll be at the University of Buckingham in the Vincent Centre from 12:30 until 13:30. If you want to go along to that, the tickets are available through the Bucks Literary Festival website, and the address is on the page there. And that brings me to the end. I just want to say finally, thanks to the audience, because without the audience, these events are really, no point in having them. So thank you all. Do have a look on the website where you'll find more information about what we're up to, and including information about how you can donate to the Trust. These lectures are free, and we're delighted to make sure that they continue to be free, but the work that we do to maintain the military history and heritage of Buckinghamshire is not free, and so every little donation helps us to achieve our mission. So that's all from me. Thank you very much indeed, and I'll say good night.